Spartan who take revenge on their misogynistic boss. Very, very much recommended. So these are ERA marches in New York City, women's places in the White House. More of the ERA signage. And this photograph shows how that photograph was used. So sometimes it's interesting to see where they go. This is the photograph you just saw. And it's an exhibit at the Civil War Museum in historic Tredegar, Virginia, called Legacies. Legacies of the Civil War, including the women's rights movement, I guess. Here's an event that I don't think anyone else photographed. Many of the events I photographed I wasn't assigned to photograph, and they weren't actually published ever at the time. This was one of those. This was a demonstration to get the New York Times to use the term Ms., which had already entered the Merriam-Webster dictionary in 1974. Do you know when the New York Times actually did start to use the term Ms.? Do you guess? 74, 75, 76, 77? 1986. They published a little editor's note, like a correction, only the New York Times doesn't call them corrections, right? So, and very disingenuously, they say that, well, it's now entered the common parlance. So more views of the street demonstrations and Funny Womanhood seminar. Trying to reclaim bad jokes and vulgar physical humor for women, so that not only men could use that kind of humor. So there's a whole range of, what feminists were involved in at the time, including some very playful and exciting things. Now Deanne Stillman, who's applying the pie, doesn't want me to show this photograph on her website. She feels she's gone on to more serious things, and she's written wonderful books about the wild horses. She's a wild horse advocate. And so again, the women's rights and the animal rights, it's not just for me, other of the women that I photographed have taken this path. But I still think that this was a noble attempt. So this is a little bit, I think now we're going into a series of photographs of New York, and more about gender, of course, and image. I worked for Brooklyn Today, a very short-lived daily newspaper, and of course I realize now that the World Trade Center's in that picture, as well as the sort of ominous handprint. And more of New York that's disappeared, unfortunately. Port Authority bus terminal. Bill Kunstler, a very radical gay lawyer, lived on Gay Street in the Village. Los Angeles Free Press, publisher Art Kunken, at a More journalism convention, which I think you were at probably, right? Ballet Trocadero de Monte Carlo, main choreographer. This is a male troupe that dances in toe shoes, and they're still going actually, not with the same dancers or artistic director, but probably the same accoutrements, and very, very interesting comment on ballet. Larry Rivers at his art opening at the Jewish Museum playing sax. This is the Lower East Side gallery scene in 1984, and Richard Hamilton a film is being made about him. He's still alive despite I don't know how many decades use of heroin, and a film's being made about him. So. This is the creator of Cookie Monster, Frank Oz, at Cookie Monster's debut. My daughter Barbara on Fifth Avenue with her role, what is supposed to be a role model, and also the bag lady. Fashion Week at the Plaza. Sean McBride, UN High Commissioner for Namibia, receiving an award from Amnesty International. Barbara Walters. Cornell Kappa with the milk drop. This isn't my most, well anyway. Charlotte Moorman, who performed in a bag and then would bare different parts of her body. And there are other parts of her body visible on other slides on my website, you know, but I didn't know if there'd be any children here or whatever. James Brown, I was on stage with James Brown. This was the most amazing assignment, just for sheer thrill. Andy Warhol, totally not a thrill. But, you know, we saw him in New York, right? I mean, you'd see him at almost every party you could go to. And he would just be watching. He'd be walking through and watching. I never really saw him do much else. Dance performance. She doesn't want this on her website because her hand is in motion. No, I won't. Salvador Dali in Ultraviolet. Shirley MacLaine with the Ballet Trocadero. I'm actually not getting this to forward very easily. Not sure why that is. Here's Ms. Lillian at the very moment that she heard her son was declared the winner. You can see her.
Do younger people know who Miss Lillian is?
Yeah, Ms. Lillian.
Yeah, she was the mother of Jimmy Carter.
Yeah.
Very well-known character.
She actually went into the Peace Corps when she was 70 years old or something like that. And now none of his websites or presidential libraries have anything about her in them. But they had a wedding cake, they had a White House shaken cake ready, and they all pulled off their coats at the right time to say Jimmy won. And here she is hugging her other son, Billy, who was known as a ne'er-do-well and actually apparently a very thoughtful and well-read man who was much maligned by the press. Surprise. So, a one-room schoolhouse in Ulster County. I did a series, won a grant from the New York State Council on the Arts to photograph one-room schools of Ulster County. I found 200 of them in this county, upstate New York. I photographed 75 of them. And you can see the teacher here. When you saw the photograph of this was empty. And here's the teacher. And she wanted to get, oh no, this is the teacher, Miss Maroon. She wanted to get a whole group of her students together to do a reunion. And the old school photograph is up on top. And she died about 3 months later, so it's fortunate that we got that together. So here is the Women's Pentagon Action, which is took place in 1980, starting with an approach through Arlington National Cemetery. And then there were enough women there to actually encircle the Pentagon, which is a huge building. So the crowd was enormous. And there were a lot of signs and banners, but also the main action was to try to prevent people from going in and out of the building without being challenged for their work. So this shows a little bit of the confrontation that was going on. And an amusing view of one of the workshops. The bicentennial at Concord in 1975, the reenactors, including very young reenactors. And today, you know, the counter whatever celebrations seem, you know, even more almost historic. than what we thought was the history. Ronald Reagan in 1976. So in 76, I tried the same thing I'd done with McGovern. We call the Reagan campaign. I'd like to get on the press bus. I'm a freelance photographer. No, I don't have an assignment. It's on spec, whatever. And it worked. So I got on the press bus with Reagan. That was not the year that he won. He was, Gerald Ford was the candidate that year, but it was interesting to see him and Nancy close up. View of the Capitol and the Renaissance Fair in Orinda, California in 1971. Probably an early Renaissance fair. Okay, so this was a great assignment, photographing Malcolm Forbes at his castle in Normandy, Balleroy. He was also the Harley distributor for the United States, so he, had to take his Harley for a ride. From the air in a balloon, his castle and his logo on the fireworks displays. My place at the table. This is like a highlight of being a photographer. Most of it is not nearly so much fun, but that was a really great assignment. Lot of fun. Up on the rooftop near the Eiffel Tower with Forbes. Does anyone read Forbes magazine today? Yes, a couple of nods, maybe, yeah. Yeah. Nice family, gave me a lot of work. Okay, so here is the beginning of the coverage of the First National Women's Conference.